Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. As a high school English and social studies teacher, I had no unique skills or training to become a religious studies teacher other than a teaching certificate, a curious worldview, and some undergraduate courses in religious studies. I was asked if I were interested in teaching a religious studies course to seniors, and I accepted, simple as that. I had a great mentor who taught the material for more than 25 years who was very helpful. I'm sure that I made many mistakes over the years, but the students and I were on a journey together, and it just worked. So I taught many religions I had never practiced in my religious studies courses. I brought in insider perspectives when I could in the form of guest speakers, but for the most part, I was a complete outsider to these beliefs, faiths, and philosophies. That said, my qualifications to teach the class were also never challenged. For example, nobody ever said to me, "You aren't Jewish, so you can't teach Judaism." I received the benefit of the doubt, always, without a PhD in religious studies or even a bachelor's degree in the content. So the guest on this episode is Dr. Simran Jeet Singh, and he is someone who does have a PhD in religious studies, and he is someone who has been challenged for teaching about a religion he doesn't practice. So Singh is a columnist for Religion News Service, senior fellow at the Sikh Coalition. He's chaplain at New York University and Columbia University, and the governor's Interfaith Advisory Committee for the state of New York. Dr. Singh's recent piece in Religion News Service is called "How Colonialism Still Colors Our Ideas About Who Gets to Teach Religion." In the article, he recounts his credibility being challenged by a colleague because he was teaching about Buddhism with students when he himself is not a Buddhist, he's Sikh. I have taught Buddhism many times and was never questioned about not being Buddhist. So in a sit-down at my house a few days before Christmas in 2019, Dr. Singh and I chatted about the complexities of teaching about religion, his books, the religious and journalistic visibility of Sikhs in the United States, and more. You can find his work at simranjeetsingh.com, on Twitter at SikhProf, and as host of the Spirited podcast, where he's interviewed guests such as Representative Ilhan Omar and the comedian Hari Kondabolu on issues such as faith and justice. These links and a link to the Religion News Service article referenced earlier are available in the show notes. So, without further delay, here's my conversation with Dr. Simran Jeet Singh, recorded in Buffalo, New York.
Very nice.
So what do you like about Buffalo?
I like how chill it is. It's pretty low-key. After being in New York City, I spent the last 2 days in coffee shops.
Yeah.
And it's kind of embarrassing to admit where I went, but I went to Whole Foods.
I loved when you texted me from there yesterday.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I mentioned that to you. Yeah. I love grocery stores, like big open grocery stores, and they have decent coffee and a space to walk around where I don't have to be in the snow. So, yeah, I like the openness. I like wings. Wings are nice.
Yeah.
And
Where do you go?
Wings.
What's your place?
I've come to be a Duff's person.
Okay. Do you go the extra crispy like Obama?
I go extra crispy. I'd never had wings until I came to Buffalo for the first time, I guess about 14, 15 years ago.
Nice.
And now it's every time I'm here.
Do you come every year? Do you come every, often?
Yeah, so my in-laws are here.
Okay,
so
cool.
We come at least twice a year. It's a short flight from New York.
Sure. I mean, it's a cheap flight, too. Is your partner like a Buffalo person, like born and raised?
Not born. So she was born in India, in Amritsar, Punjab. Spent some of her time in Iowa after moving here, and then they moved to Buffalo. So my father-in-law is a professor at UB. But she's not born and raised here, but she's
hardcore Buffalo.
Yeah.
I mean, the people who are here, man, it's like, I'm wearing like a Buffalo band shirt that's like a mashup of the Sabres right now. Well, awesome. Well, welcome to my home. I love having people over to talk about their areas of interest and expertise on the show, and it's just such a cool vibe to have like the in-person dynamic. It just changes it up a little bit versus recording over Skype and Zoom and things like that. So welcome to our house, and I'm so glad that you're here.
Thank you. Yeah.
So Dr. Simran Jeet Singh, professor, writer, activist, podcaster colleague, if I may. Welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Can you just introduce yourself a tiny little bit to the audience and maybe say what some of your favorite projects are that you got going on right now?
Sure. I'm born and raised in San Antonio, Texas. Sikh American, so follow the Sikh tradition. Hoping we'll talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely.
Today. Big Spurs fan because I'm from San Antonio. That's important to myself and my family.
Yeah, David Robinson, man, old school.
David Robinson was just drafted right when I was starting to watch TV and sports and stuff, and so that's what I grew up with. It was Robinson and Duncan. So yeah, basketball is big. Sports are big to me. Yeah, and now I live in New York City with my family. I teach. I write. I like that stuff. The big projects, I guess there are three. One is the podcast, Spirited, which has been a lot of fun. Just interviewing leaders that I admire from various walks of life about how they bring their beliefs into the way that they live their lives. So thinking about what integrity and justice looks like based on our value systems, whatever they might be.
And I love the fact about podcasts that it gives us this opportunity to talk to people that we never would have otherwise had the chance to talk to and create these new like relationships and expand our own minds. Like it's like the ultimate avenue for me for like maintaining a curiosity about the world.
Yeah, exactly. So this is my first season. I just started, and that's what I keep telling people. If I'd known this was available as a profession, as a career, as even as a hobby, like I'd have been doing it a long time ago because it's just fun. You just sit there and you learn from people that you respect and you want to learn from. It's really cool.
Yeah. Well, and another thing I know that you have a hobby is running, and I know that you're a marathoner. Do you have any favorite marathons that you would suggest people check out if they're runners?
Well, my favorite is the largest in the world, New York City. That's where I started.
Your first marathon was New York City Marathon?
Oh,
dude, come on. That's great.
Exactly. And so you can't really go down from there. But the vibe is amazing. There you have fans and spectators and supporters for the entire 26 miles. So it's really fun. Detroit was also really fun.
My wife ran Detroit.
Oh yeah,
she really liked it
across to Canada.
Yeah, when you run through the bridge to Windsor.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I really enjoyed that marathon. So yeah, that's a good one too.
Excellent. Well, you should come to Buffalo sometime too, because it's the end of May, and the average weather is like 60 degrees. Last year we had fog that was in off the lake, so we were completely shrouded in fog, like almost the entire race.
And you finish in the Bill Stadium, right?
You don't finish in the Bill Stadium because that's down south in Orchard Park, but you do amazing circuits through downtown and Allentown and Elmwood Village, and the scenery, the whole route is really great.
That's great. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, the reason why I was really excited to have you on the show is because we get to talk about teaching a lot, and teaching as religious studies folks. Like I'm more of in the high school area, you're more of in the higher education level, but it's a convergence that you and I have. And I want to talk about the importance of providing powerful learning opportunities for all people with regards to religion. So here we are, two people who have taught about the religions of the world, me at the secondary, you at the post-secondary. And we've both taught about religions that we don't personally practice to hundreds, if not thousands, of people in our classrooms, throughout the last however many years of our careers. And you recently had an experience that I wanted to ask you about, and you had your legitimacy as an objective educator sort of called into question, right? And I'm curious if you can say your version of events that you can recall, because I find that teaching about religions that you don't practice is very interesting, and I love doing it. And I'm curious if you can say how that negative experience transpired for you.
Yeah, sure. I guess the short story is I was at a conference with about 10,000 scholars of religion. Probably the nerdiest place you could ever be.
Love it. I follow the hashtags from those conferences, and I love it.
It's hilarious. And so I'm teaching Buddhism this year at the graduate level. It's a course this semester. It's Global Histories of Buddhism. Next semester, it's Indo-Tibetan Buddhism.
Oh, very cool.
So I'm teaching at the graduate level, and it's not what people would assume that I teach because I'm a Sikh, and so I ran into a few folks who asked what I'm teaching, and I mentioned Buddhism, and I had a couple of responses where someone said something like, "Oh, well, isn't that a conflict of interest? You're a Sikh teaching Buddhism. Like, you must be biased, right?" That's the assumption. And somebody else said something like, just straight up like, "Well, you're not even Buddhist." And, fine. Like, those are observations.
Yeah, those are like factually true things.
Yeah. So I understand that. But I also think, and I know that there is a double standard when it comes to people who come from other. Well, let me say it this way. I think it's racialized.
Yeah.
Me being a Sikh who is in the academy that's teaching about something that's not my own faith seems to strike people as confusing or inappropriate, whereas the entire academy is filled with people, mostly white folks, who are teaching traditions they don't practice,
Right.
and we don't really question the legitimacy of that. And so that was, to me, the comments themselves weren't really upsetting. It's more that when it comes from people who are within the field itself,
Yeah.
and don't realize that these double standards exist, and then sort of perpetuate them. That to me is kind of like, oh, let's at least understand what we're doing here.
Well, and the thing that's really interesting to me about that is that has never happened to me personally. Like, I taught in the middle of Missouri in the high school level, but I taught about Sikhism, Jainism, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism. I talked about plenty of things that I don't personally do, and no one ever batted an eyelash about that. So whenever you talk about the racialized thing, I'm sitting here, a 36-year-old upper middle class raised white man from St. Louis, Missouri, teaching about religions of the world that personally, like, I'm not even an expert in, but because I had a teaching certificate in that particular state, in that particular content area, I was allowed to do it, and I was given total legitimacy to do it, even though I didn't hold graduate degrees in those subjects. I just found them to be interesting and compelling and worth discussing for young people of the world, but I could have been doing a terrible job, and my legitimacy was never called into question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And before this position, I was teaching Islamic studies in Texas. And, people did say the same thing, right? Like, people often said, "Well, you're a Sikh teaching Islam." Even when I interviewed for the job, somebody said that. What are you doing as a Sikh teaching Islam? It's a common question, and it's undergirded by these assumptions of who has authority and who has bias and these sorts of things. But the difference in this situation was I had never been questioned by fellow scholars.
That was shocking to me.
In Texas. Yeah, exactly. It was always sort of like lay people, students, everyday Texans.
Sure.
But when it comes from a scholar, it's like, oh, wait, I think you would agree with me if you would agree with me with my critique of you if you took a step back and realized the assumptions behind what you're saying right here. Like, and they did, for the most part, the people that I talked to.
So, can you describe, like, why you think it's totally fine for somebody who is a scholar or a teacher to teach about religions that they don't personally practice? Because I know that you have an insider-outsider perspective on that you write about in the piece that I read on, what publication did you put that piece in?
Religion News Service. I have a regular column there. Yeah.
Excellent. So if you read that article, I mean, that's what we're talking about here. And in there, you write about the insider perspective of teaching and the outsider perspective of teaching. What are the pros and cons to those two, terms?
Well, I mean, there's a lot. There are a lot of pros and cons. The easy ones to identify, I think, are when you're teaching a tradition that you practice or that you identify with. You might have some personal attachment to it and want others to like it. And so you might downplay some of the problems, or hide some of the ways in which that tradition is engaged in oppression or violence or anything that might be construed as negative.
Yeah.
So I think that, to me, that's the big one when it comes to, like, well, you must be biased if you're a Sikh teaching Sikhism. That doesn't seem right. We want an objective perspective.
Sure.
On the other hand, coming in as an outsider, one might say, well, you understand this tradition intellectually, but if religion is about experience and practice, what can you really say to that? You might be able to describe it, but do you really feel it? Are you really able to then communicate it and transmit that to your students? So that's a common critique of people who are coming in from the outside.
Do you actively teach courses about Sikhism as well?
I have, and I enjoyed it more than I thought I would even. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Well, I think generally I like teaching about religion for a couple of reasons. One is because it's not something that we teach as a society to our kids, different religious traditions and different ways of thinking. I find it to be really powerful and transformative for people to come to realize that there are other ways of living and being in this world, and to expand their minds in that way, and to learn how to accept that and humanize people who are different. Like that to me is really rewarding. The other part of teaching religion generally is because it's just something that I love, right?
Yeah.
Not just my own tradition, but I just find religion so fascinating and so beautiful and powerful, and interesting, even when it's not beautiful, even when it's, crazy and
well, it matters,
and horrible, right? Yeah, exactly. And so because I love it so much, I just love sharing that love with other people.
Can you give, do you have any examples of things that jump out at you whenever you're teaching about Sikhism from the insider perspective, things that you're able to do that like a non-Sikh like me would do in my own classroom? Like, how do you feel like that really boosts your abilities as opposed to someone like me teaching about it?
Well, I think it's a really good question. In a way that I'm not able to do for Buddhism or Islam or Hinduism, which are other traditions that I teach, I can reach into my own training as a Sikh and talk about stories or memories or ways of living that are authentic as lived traditions in a way that I can't really with any of the other religions that I teach. And so it's very easy for me to go back into my own training as a Sikh and say, well, this is the way that Sikhs transmit scripture. This is how I learned it from my parents. This is how I'd repeat it. This is how we would sing it. And this is how I observed Sikhs across the world doing it. Whereas the only way that I've seen that in other traditions is on YouTube, or I've read about it. And so it's not really ingrained in me so deeply that if somebody asks me, well, what are the first stories that kids learn about the Prophet Muhammad? I don't necessarily know, and I might be reading about it, but it's always secondhand, I guess, is the point.
Yeah.
Whereas that firsthand piece, it just comes so naturally, and it feels so much more authentic.
Well, yeah, and there's a Gurdwara down the street from my house here, just a mile, right here on Main Street down in Williamsville, New York. And every time I go past there, I'm thinking about those experiences of me driving past the Gurdwara right now, and I'm thinking about how your life experiences from inside the building versus my experiences from outside the building driving past, and how that would be such a more powerful teaching moment in a classroom. Do you ever have guests come in to talk to your students whenever you are doing a semester of a religion that you don't personally practice?
I do. I mean, I try to do both, whether I practice it or not.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is I really think that one of the dangers of teaching religion is, and one of the dangers we have in how we think about religion is we always try and say, well, what does this religion believe, or what does this religion teach? And we all know as people that things are more complicated than that religions are interpreted by different people differently. And even though I am a scholar and an expert on religion, that doesn't necessarily mean that whatever I think a religion should look like is what it should look like, right? I have an authority in a classroom, but not necessarily in a religious tradition. And so keeping that balance is really important, I think.
You just said the word complicated, and that's one of the things that I would always say to my students. They would ask me a question, and I would say, well, it depends. That was the answer to almost all the times they ever asked me questions.
It's a good teaching trick.
How do you complicate and make your students aware of the insider outsider perspective over the course of an entire semester? Do you constantly refer back to the insider versus outsider perspective in your own classroom?
The insider outsider perspective, not so much. Well, I think it depends on the level of the student, I guess. At the introductory undergraduate level, I think that's a really important and helpful distinction for people who have never really thought about it before.
Yeah.
So I imagine if I'm teaching high school students as well, that would be a really important node for helping people understand their own position in relation to a tradition, which then helps you understand other people's positions. I think one of the things that I've become more interested in, especially now that I'm teaching graduate students who are more sort of sophisticated in their understanding of religion, is actually now, instead of going horizontal from like what is the insider outsider, now I find myself going vertical and saying like, well, what does the history of the category of religion look like? Where does it come from? Who made it up? Like, it was made up at some point,
right?
How is that history? What does that history tell us about the power dynamics, and why does it end up being that these people get to make the rules and these people get left out, or these people get marginalized, or these people get erased, or whatever, right? So like that to me has become a more interesting play for more, advanced students, in part because it really helps me think about other aspects of this world, not just about religion, but like, why is the world the way that it is, right? It's not just because of these horizontal dynamics. It's also like things have been building up over history, and that's really been changing the course of how we relate to one another and how we see ourselves.
After I read this article that you sent me about your experience at the conference, where somebody questioned your like ability to teach Buddhism, I waded down below in the comments section a little bit in that article into the muck. And I made it like 2 or 3 comments, and I just couldn't do it anymore. And, the amount of time that people spend on like insanely unproductive commentary into the internet void is really baffling to me.
For sure.
But you are very, very active on Twitter, on writing for mass audiences, on putting yourself out there in these situations. And you sort of talked about this a little bit with Hari Kondabalo on your podcast, but how do you deal with these very negative pushbacks whenever you say, like, because they're constantly commenting on words like racialized, marginalized, like they're pushing back on these things. Like, do you have any strategies for staying sane in these conversations? Because you're so public with it, you're so out there and so present.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think strategy number 1 is never look at the comments. I think that's something I learned early, because that's a cesspool.
Do your mentions just get destroyed on Twitter like every day?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's, for me, one of the harder things has been figuring out how to strike the balance. Like I've had personal trouble taking seriously the hate that comes my way, because most of the time it's anonymous and it doesn't seem real.
Yeah.
But I've actually had to be talked into taking it more seriously for safety considerations.
Sure.
Like my family, now that I have kids, like thinking about that sort of thing. But in terms of staying sane, I think there are 2 things for me. I think one is it's one of the things my parents taught me as a kid was that it's really important to have your values clear. Like, what are your values? Why are you doing what you do? And if you use those as your guideposts, then when I guess it keeps you out of trouble. You're always intentional about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And so for me, I look at all of this work as education. Like, everything comes through the lens of education. And so that helps me stay sane, that I don't sort of get diverted or lost in trying to deal with some of that stuff.
Does your training in your life in Sikhism, does that advance your educational goal in that regard?
I mean, I guess in this regard, particularly, I guess one of the advantages I could say I have is that I've been dealing with hate and racism since I was a kid. And so like I had to learn from elementary school, like, what do you do when people treat you differently because of how you look? And so that, I think that helped me develop a thick skin. I'm still like dispositionally, I'm still like a people pleaser.
Yeah.
And so I have a thick skin in terms of when somebody is racist, it doesn't bother me. what bothers me, what's hard for me is when the people that I'm hoping to serve dislike me for some reason, for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times those criticisms are valid. I agree with them. But they're a lot of times overly simplistic. And so that to me is hard. How do I sort of show that balance, and when do I engage, and how do I engage, or do I engage?
Did you follow the recent Canadian election with the NDP candidate, Jagmeet Singh?
I did, yeah, and one of my upcoming podcast interviews is with them.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Did you two talk about this issue at all of like growing up and like realizing like that people see you in a different way, then you can't just like be a kid from like growing up?
We didn't talk about it in our conversation.
I look forward to hearing that one.
Yeah.
That was such an interesting election too, because the way that he was constantly dealing with people coming at him and the way that he was respond in the moment.
Yeah.
I was blown away, because like in moments like that, if somebody was coming at me with the vitriol and the burning desire to be against me,
right,
the way that he would respond was so incredible.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it was just very moving.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, one of the things, I spend a lot of my time with the civil rights organization and, working on the front lines of hate. One of the things I've really been impressed by is that pretty much every single hate crime that I've worked on, witnessed, it's been consistently true that the person who has been targeted has responded in a very similar way, where it's, I'll say it this way, like it's been very rare for me to see people in my own community respond to hate with hate. And that's been really inspirational to me. So part of the book that I'm working on right now is exploring that question, like where does that come from? It's not necessarily human nature. We don't see that all over the world. And so what is it about Sikh teachings in particular that enables that, or at least inspires that sort of action?
Is it the book you just referred to? Is that your book that's coming out in 2021?
Yes, exactly.
So it's the from what I gathered, it's an adult nonfiction book on Sikh wisdom for our current times. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So what can readers expect, and why would you encourage any curious person, not just Sikhs, but any curious person? Why would you encourage them to anticipate that book? What's firing you up about writing this book?
Well, there are a few things. I think one of the interesting aspects of the Sikh experience in America today is we're so visible. Like I was working at a coffee shop before coming here, turban, beard, brown skin, in a context where like people don't really see that, and people in the coffee shop were looking at me and like wondering what I was doing there, and I was drinking coffee.
Yeah,
yeah. What else? What am I supposed to say? So we're so highly visible. Everybody notices wherever we are, and yet nobody knows who we are. Like nobody in America knows who Sikhs are. Like it's the world's 5th largest religion, and yet it's our cultural literacy around religion generally is poor, but our literacy around Sikhs is horrible. Like 70% of Americans don't know who Sikhs are. And so for me, one of the exciting things about the book is like this is a way to introduce the tradition. And I could do that through a textbook, but to me that's not exciting. And even the way we were talking about teaching religion before, like I don't find it interesting, even as a scholar of religion, to teach religion through some formula of like what is the history of the scripture and what is the history of the prophethood and that, right? Like
right.
It's about like who are these people and what do they do and why do they do it? Like what life force does this tradition have and how does it pertain to our world today? And so that to me is what's exciting about the book. Like what are the big burning questions of our lives today? And then what does Sikhi have to teach us, which I think is, for me at least, has been super powerful.
The visibility thing that you just mentioned is really important to me, and I keep thinking of the Daily Show segment with Waris Abduwalia, where he's like, being interviewed about like pumping gas, and things like that is cracking me up. But just somebody who might be listening, like a lot of people who listen to this show are very informed on religion, but I also do have a lot of people that have, they're very much beginners and they just want to listen to the show because they know that I'm not going to talk about it in a super thick academic way. Do you know what I mean? Like I want this to be accessible. So maybe you could talk just a little bit about the basics of how to recognize a Sikh, like in public, like what are the articles of faith that you can see people, because you mentioned that visibility, but people don't understand the visibility, then they're going to misunderstand it. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that just very briefly.
Yeah, sure. I guess the place to begin is the sort of meat and potatoes of Sikh identity when we talk about it is the turban and beard, and it's a weird thing that's come to be. It's weird that this has come to be the way that we think about Sikhs, because that is a very particular form of the identity, right? Like that's only men with the beards, right? So like that's half the population that gets erased in that image itself.
Yeah.
So, but it's also true that the turban and the beard become hallmarks of the tradition when this community is pretty much only talked about as victims of hate crimes in this country. So that's sort of where that comes from. But there's in addition to the turban and the beard, there are what you described as articles of faith. There are 5 articles of faith that we maintain. The 2 most noticeable are a bracelet that Sikhs wear on their wrists, and uncut hair case is what we called it, and those are the 2 sort of outward expressions that one can see on a Sikh's body if they're in public.
So if there's a woman too, she would still have the steel bracelet, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Everyone has the bracelet. I think that, to me, in my understanding, that is the most common of the forms of the identity. Like every Sikh that I know, whether they wear a turban or not, whether they cut their hair or not, still wears that bracelet.
Yeah.
And then the second most common is the uncut hair.
Yeah.
And that's also true for men and women. Neither cut their hair. Most men who keep their hair wrap it in turbans, and then some women do as well. But it's long uncut, or at least mine was long, and then now hitting mid-30s, it's starting to
thin out a little bit.
Starting to thin out.
Oh yeah, well I'm
oh, there we go. Yeah, exactly.
I am in that club, my friend. There is nothing going on top of my head.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the nice thing about a turban. Like nobody needs to know.
Yeah. Well, another thing, like there's like a dagger, right? And one time I had a guest speaker come into my classroom and talk to my high school students, and they were like, "What about a dagger? I heard there's a dagger." And he pulled out a necklace with a pendant on it, and the pendant was the dagger. There was a teeny tiny little pendant for the dagger that he wore around his neck every day.
Yeah, and there are different Sikhs who feel differently. Well, the Sikhs who carry the dagger, some do. It's called a kirpan. Some maintain it as the traditional, larger dagger that you wear on your body, and say that a pendant would not count as one of those, but some believe that the pendant counts. And so it's just another example of how diverse religions are within that, like people who have equal authority in claiming their devotion to Sikhism practice it very differently.
Have you ever gone to the Golden Temple of Amritsar?
I have, yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because I've only seen it in videos, and it is stunning and overwhelming, and I imagine that it's quite interesting in person as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, India is a different place. It's probably the most obvious thing I've
it's
said,
okay.
said in a while. But even living in New York City and like the rush of New York, like I feel like India is intense. Like the population density is high.
Like Manhattan is mellow compared.
Exactly. Yeah, it's loud. There are a lot of people, like all that sort of thing. And I've never found a more peaceful place than the Golden Temple, which is in the middle of this like historic big city, Amritsar, and it's a border town, like it's right on the edge of Pakistan. So like it's really interesting location. It's, I guess, one of my favorite things in the world is going to places where you can witness devotion of people. Like in religion, so many people are religious, but they're not necessarily sincere. And so to see like sincere devotion where people are just literally like spending their lives with the most earnest love that you can ever see, like I find that powerful. And it's not, I see it at the Golden Temple. There are other religious traditions and places where I've seen this sort of thing. But the Golden Temple, to me, every time I go, it's like, wow, this is a beautiful, beautiful thing to just be a part of. Like, I feel like it's historic. And then it's also like this sense of community where, yeah, the love I feel there is unparalleled.
How many times have you gone?
I can't remember. I've spent a few summers. I've spent summers in Amritsar, and so
nice.
Yeah,
so you try to put eyes on that thing, on that building often whenever you visit. I'd imagine.
Exactly. Yeah, and it never really gets old either. So you can go every day, and it's a fresh experience.
So you mentioned earlier about how the way that Sikhs are seen in the media in the United States, and oftentimes whenever they are given visibility in the media, it's like as victims of a certain crime or, a hate crime. And you have a book that you put out called Covering Sikhs. And it's like a guidebook for journalists covering Sikhism accurately. What can you tell me a little bit about that? Or are there any positive results that you've seen from that book where journalists have been like, thank you for that. Here's how I'm changing my practices. Have you seen any results come your way?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one of the clear differences we've seen over the past 10 years, 20 years since 9/11, you could say, is like 20 years ago, there was little to no coverage of Sikhism. I mean, Sikhs have been in this country for 100 years, and for the whole time we've been invisible. And it's been painful for the community that we have not been a part of any conversation. After 9/11, we realized as a community that had to change, that there is real danger in being so unknown and so misunderstood. And so we started to think about that, and one of the outcomes was, well, if journalists aren't covering us, let's understand why. And as I started getting into that world a little bit, I learned that people who cover religion are scared to cover religions they don't know because that's hard. And if you misrepresent something, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And so it's a tough job for a journalist who's expected to know a lot about a lot of different things. I mean, even if you're just covering religion, like there's no scholar that I know who can teach all the different religions. Like nobody does that.
Right.
And so for journalists, what we realized was to help mitigate some of those fears, they needed some resources that they could go to and trust, where they could say, okay, I want to do a story on Sikhism. This is good, basic information I could use to supplement my work. And so that's what we did. That's why we put out that resource. And we've seen quite a bit of, quite a good increase in coverage of Sikhism in journalism. And so that's been quite positive.
Do you have any journalists that you, collaborate with or communicate with regularly that you wanted to, send people their way as far as like who do you read, who do you want to promote, kind of thing?
Oh yeah, sure. In the religion world,
yeah.
In terms of broadcast, there are two folks who I work with quite closely. Dina Zingaro at 60 Minutes, CBS.
Oh, cool.
And Liz Kinnicky was also at CBS Religion and Culture, and now she's freelancing. In the print world, I've worked a lot with Javed Kaleem, who's at LA Times, fantastic religion and race reporter.
Excellent.
A great beat. Kelsey Dallas at Deseret News.
Kelsey Dallas's articles are great. I read her all the time.
Yeah, she's always putting out like, she has this really special ability to consolidate and distill really complicated things into ways that even I can understand.
Awesome.
So yeah, I really like Kelsey's stuff. Who else do I like? I really like the work of Julie Zosmer at Washington Post.
Yeah.
And Sarah Pulliam Bailey and Michelle Borstein. That team is quite good as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about your podcast, Spirited.
Sure.
How did that come about, and why did you decide to go that route of getting into this world of podcasting?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not something I ever imagined myself doing. I mean, I guess like nothing that I'm doing now, other than being in the academic world, is something that I imagine myself doing.
Yeah.
I grew up as someone who is like deathly afraid of public speaking, all the way through graduate school, actually. And so, podcasting or radio in any way, it just wasn't on my radar. And about a year ago, I got in touch with some folks who are starting a new audio app called Venly. And it's about sort of spirituality in a way that speaks to young people today who aren't necessarily as interested in institutional religion.
Yeah.
But are still looking for like wisdom and guidance and the kinds of things that they might get from religious teachers. And so I started working with them, and then we got into this conversation of like, well, these are short perspectives, we call them, like 3 to 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But what would it look like to have long form conversations where we talk about these same issues that we care about, but do it in depth with people we also admire? And so that's where we started getting the idea. I think one of the remarkable things for me in that coming together has been the maturity and humility of the guests. Like that combination has been so cool, because what it means is these people who are like some of the top leaders in the country in whatever fields they're in, they'll come to the room with me and they'll start talking about like their real personal challenges, and things like stuff that they've really dealt with in their lives in a way that like I'm sitting there, I'm like, you are one of the most brilliant people I've ever met.
Yeah.
And I can't believe you, like, the kinds of things you're thinking about are also the kinds of things that I think about. So it's really relatable to me in that sense, and like really practical.
Well, and you've had Representative Ilhan Omar. You've had the fantastic comedian Hari Kondabolu. And your conversation with Hari was really interesting because you asked him a lot about staying safe.
Yeah.
And that was that's kind of an interesting parallel to this conversation as well, where we've talked about like, violence and racialization and marginalization and oppression. Do you have any thoughts on like what Hari said about, staying safe and things like that in this country as like a religious or a visible minority?
Yeah. The conversation with Hari was interesting in many ways. I mean, one is because he's a comedian, and so my entire goal was to make him laugh at least once. And another thing was, I mean, he has a background in human rights, and he's brilliant. And so that week we had just happened to read Orientalism for class, and I didn't want to bring it up and like push it on him and like I didn't expect him to know it, but like he said something and it made me think about something from Said's book, and I shared that, and he just like totally ate it up and then spit it back out and like gave me something else fresh to think about. So that was super surprising to me in terms of what kinds of things people have within them that doesn't necessarily surface as their identity. So like you see this comedian talking about mangoes or like being Indian or whatever. You would never think that he has a history of community organizing and human rights and could talk about, Gramsci and Said like he did, right? Like, but it made me really think about these conversations I'm having with people, like who has heard Representative Ilhan Omar talk about her personal journey. I mean, it's one of the most remarkable and inspiring journeys that any of us could ever hear about as a refugee, as an immigrant, as this rise to becoming, a groundbreaking politician. Well,
and you can't hear that story if you stay in one lane.
Exactly.
And I feel like that's something that we're so bad at, is not getting out of our lane.
Yeah.
As a nation.
Yeah, exactly. And so for me, it was that conversation with Hari really revealed something to me that was like, it's not just that these people enjoy talking about something that they don't usually get to talk about. It's also that we don't really see them as humans, because we're used to like sort of categorizing these people as like, oh, that's a politician and that's a comedian and that's a preacher. And like the preacher can't talk about having a therapist, which she did. And I was like, wait, you have a,
Yeah.
Pastor Amy Butler, who I interviewed, she talked about her therapist. And I was like, wait, why do pastors need therapists? And she was like, because we're people.
Well,
I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that.
And the amount of things that people put on you as like a clergy or a religious leader in any community, I would imagine that the baggage that you carry with you every day is so heavy that you have to have somebody to get that out on,
Yeah, exactly. No, it makes total sense when you think about it. But the problem is, I think, including for myself, like I just never thought about it, that like these people who sort of live their lives and we politicize them in whatever way and categorize them, we just forget to treat them like people. And so that to me has been like the big reveal of the podcast for me, which is like, hey, these are human beings, and everyone's a human being, and like let's learn how to treat people like that.
What have you watched or listened to recently that you would suggest to listeners? Any like good movies or series or podcasts that you personally enjoy or things like that you would direct people towards?
Yeah. So there are two films that I've watched recently that I really enjoyed. One was called Clemency, and it's a look into it's a new film. It looks into the issue of death row and mass incarceration in a way that I haven't ever seen before, through the perspective primarily of a prison warden. And one of the, I mean, it's beautifully done. It's really powerful. It's really painful. But it was such a weird film to watch in that I'm so used to things having a resolution at the end, or things to take a turn and become better, and like it never came.
Oh wow.
And it was so striking to walk away from that and be like, oh yeah, it's not just that this is something that's continuing to happen today. It's also the people who live this as part of their realities. Like they don't ever get any resolution, whether you're on the side of being executed or your family member, or you're on the side of the warden or an officer. And so, yeah, just the sort of pain that we wreak on ourselves, that stuck with me. The other film, which I really loved, was it's a new documentary called Same God. And it's the story of Larisha Hawkins, who was at Wheaton College, a black female professor who wore a hijab in solidarity with Muslims, and she was fired.
Yeah, I remember this.
Totally like flipped her life upside down. And I'd followed that story years ago when it happened. But to hear her explain why she felt so compelled to stand her ground. I mean, she easily could have, and most people would have, she easily could have stepped back and said, it's not worth it.
Right.
She could have towed the line and said, like, I still support Muslims. I apologize for crossing the line and doing something that was inappropriate. But she really believed steadfastly in what she was doing as an act of justice and solidarity, and made a major sacrifice for that, for sticking to her principles. And so I found that really compelling to hear her rationale and her conviction.
Yeah, the integrity that people exhibit in moments of strife, and when you're on the fence about going one way or the other, it is one of the most truly inspiring moments that you can ever witness.
Yeah, and we see so little of it today. So, I mean, even situations like Colin Kaepernick's, I just find so much inspiration through stories like that. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be something that I believe in. I stand on his side within his particular case, but it doesn't even have to necessarily be on my side of the political spectrum.
Sure.
Just that willingness to sacrifice in a way that, I don't know, speaks to one's soul. Like, I really love that.
Mm. Your Twitter bio reads, "Everyone needs a Sikh friend. I'm happy to be yours." So where can people find you if they want to know more about your work and go on a digital journey with you?
So I've had to remove my email from most platforms just because of safety precautions and the nastiness that comes. But on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, I'm Sikh Prof. That's an easy way. The new exciting thing is there's a picture book coming out.
I didn't even get to ask you about the picture book.
Oh,
please,
no, that's
please describe it.
No, but that's like the next part of the journey.
Excellent.
I'm really excited about that. It's about my running inspiration. He's the first 100-year-old man to ever run a marathon.
And as a marathoner, I am all about this book.
Yeah, and he's a Sikh. He grew up as a peasant in Punjab, and it's this amazing story of a guy who dealt with disability as a kid. He couldn't walk when he was a child, so then he couldn't go to school. So he never learned to read or write. He's 108 now. He still can't read or write. So it challenges all sorts of biases that we have around ableism, around classism, around racism, around ageism. But his story is just so beautiful and powerful that I heard it and I was like, I have to write this as a children's book.
Who was the illustrator that worked with you on that?
The illustrator's name is Baljinder Kaur. She's in the UK, and so this will be the first children's book that we know of to feature a South Asian author, illustrator, and editor from a major press. So
amazing.
Super excited about
When's
that.
it coming out?
It comes out in the end of August.
Excellent. So August 2020?
August 2020.
What's the title?
It's called Fauja Singh Keeps Going.
Excellent.
The man's name is Fauja Singh. And actually, the day he ran the marathon at the age of 100, that's the day I signed up for my first one.
So cool.
Yeah,
was that like
almost shamed into it?
So that was like the reason why you did it?
Yeah, I mean, I'd been sort of dabbling in distance running a bit more. Like I was always a soccer player and a cross country runner.
Yeah.
But when he crossed that finish line, I was like, I have no more excuses. It's time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what pushed me over the edge.
Well, and every year, I mean, it gets harder and harder. Like I just turned 36 and I joined a gym to force me to cross train more so that I keep my core healthy with my back problems and stuff like that. I just, I'm looking for every chance I can get now to stay as fit as I can because I want to be here for a while.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, I dealing with back problems too. And it's
I'll show you the elliptical before you go home.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So, Dr. Singh, I'm so glad that you could come over. I'm so glad that you were willing to take some time away from the family in Buffalo, New York. Hello. It's awesome. I'm so glad that you reached out because you didn't have to, you know, and it just is so meaningful to me that you're willing to take some time and come over and sit with me at my house because I have learned a lot and I look forward to continuing to follow your work for years to come.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I enjoy your program, so it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybeck. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.